Hello YouTube, Bane666 here. So let's continue with my takedown of Knowing Better and his lies and deception about the men's rights movement.
While we're on the subject of men being the victims of violence, men can also be the victims of rape. In fact, men can be raped by women.
Well, yes and no. Unfortunately, when it comes to the legal definition of rape, it's a lot harder for men to be raped by women. And in some countries, they simply can't be raped by women at all. So, for example, in America, the legal definition of rape is the penetration, no matter how slight, of the vagina or anus with any body part or object, or oral penetration by a sex organ of another person without the consent of the victim. So, under that legal definition, it is possible for a woman to rape a man, but she needs to do so with an object. For example, if she got a dildo and shoved it up his ass, for example, then that would be classed as rape. But if she forced him to penetrate her vagina with his penis, that is not classed as rape, even though it should be. Now, in Australia, we have a very similar definition. It includes the penetration of the genitalia by a penis object, part of the body or mouth. And although it is technically not gender specific, it does exclude male victims who were forced to penetrate. Now, in the United Kingdom, it's far, far worse. The legal definition of rape in the UK is a person commits an offence if he intentionally penetrates the vagina, anus, or mouth of another person with his penis. So, under that definition, it is impossible for a woman to rape a man. And this is something that MRAs have been talking about for a long time, trying to get this changed. And of course, the UK isn't the only country which has a narrow definition that excludes male victims. Another example would be Israel. The plight of male victims. New Israeli legislation aims to change the definition of rape as we know it. Unlike other Western countries, the definition of rape in Israeli law is narrow, specifying an act perpetrated by males on females. New legislation may help change that perception, which some claim ignores the plight of male victims of sexual assault. It says, for years, Israeli child protection officers have looked on in despair as female pedophiles and incestuous mothers brought to court for molesting boys were never charged with rape. It happened several times that teachers or mothers of boys were charged with, on the basis of facts describing rape, i.e. forced sexual intercourse. And the offence could not be referred to legally as rape, and that's, of course, absurd, said attorney Vered Windman, head of the legal department of the Israeli National Council for the Child. One mother had intercourse with two of her sons, but was indicted for indecent acts, not rape. According to Israeli law, indecent acts is a less grave charge than rape and carries a less severe penalty. Article 345 of the Penal Law 1977 defines rape as penetration of a female by a body part or object without consent. Therefore, only females can be the victims of rape, and females cannot be accused of raping a boy. In contrast to Canada, Australia, South Africa, and Western European countries, Israel is the only country which, in its law, specifies the gender of the victim of sexual assault. So that's even worse than in the UK, because technically in the UK a man can be raped by another man. So you can actually have male victims, they just have to be victims of another male. But in Israel, apparently that doesn't even count. The only ones who can be victims are females. It goes on to say, according to experts, many male Israeli victims of sexual assault feel that the country's legal definition of rape is not only unjust, but also mirrors a broader problem, the the fact that society does not recognize that males are frequently subject to sexual assault and that it is an equally traumatic experience for them as female victims. Now, there has been an attempt to change this law in the past, but unfortunately it was blocked by Israeli feminist groups. And why did they block it? Well, they thought that males might start making false allegations of rape against females. I'm not joking. That was their actual argument. But anyway, we will be talking about forced to penetrate in more detail in a little while. But let's go back to knowing better.
And we should call it rape when it happens, not an affair.
Amazing! He finally got something right. That's not going to last for very long, though.
MRAs and the Red Pill again try to portray this as both sides are victims in equal numbers issue, when it isn't. Not even close. From the same source where she got her 1 in 4 men physical violence statistic, 1 in 5 women will be raped in their lifetime, while 1 in 71 men will. For every male victim, there are 14 female victims.
Well, that's not exactly right, and it all comes down to the definition of rape, which is what we talked about earlier. For example, if you were to look at the statistics in England for the number of men to be raped, I'm guessing it would be pretty low considering men can't technically be raped by women. And if you looked at the number of men being raped in Israel, it would be 0. That doesn't mean that men aren't technically being raped. It just means it doesn't meet the legal definition. And that's why these statistics shown to us by Knowing Better are in fact incorrect. It all comes down to the definition of rape used by the American legal system, which unfortunately excludes made to penetrate or forced to penetrate, whichever one you want to call it. So let's have a look at those statistics and compare them first without made to penetrate, and then we'll have a look at them with made to penetrate, and we'll see what difference that makes. So looking at the statistics without including made to penetrate, we find that Knowing Better is actually correct, and that 14 times as many women are raped as men. But the moment we add made to penetrate, that changes greatly. Suddenly it's only 3 times as many women being raped as men. Now you could argue at this point it's still a female issue, and that's a fair argument to make. But the point is the numbers are a lot closer than people like Knowing Better are willing to admit. And the fact that when we talk about rape, we talk about it in terms of something men do to women, the male victims of female perpetrators are always excluded. And not just legally, but in a social context as well. Considering 1/4 of victims of rape are male, and the majority of the perpetrators against them are in fact female, you would think that consent classes would be for both males and females, but that's not the case, is it? So if we look at the stats for women being raped over a 12-month period, we find there is 1,270,000. Now, if we compare that to the stats for males being made to penetrate, we find it is 1,267,000. So they are virtually identical. And that's not taking into account things like prison rape, which, although it does happen to women in prison as well, because yes, women do actually rape other women both in and out of prison. That's another conversation we never tend to have. But although it does happen to women in prison too, it predominantly happens to men because the majority of the prison population are in fact male.
That's an order of magnitude difference and accounts for female on male and male on male sexual violence.
But only if you exclude forced to penetrate, right? If you include that, the figures are a lot different. Now, I'm going to assume this is just ignorance on Knowing Better's part. I'm going to assume it's just bad research. I'm going to give him the benefit of the doubt in this particular case. Because the simple fact is most people out there have never even considered whether forced to penetrate is legally rape or not. And if we're talking about information which is gathered by surveys, I should also point out this.
Again, men don't like asking for help.
Yeah, that's right. Men are less likely to admit to a stranger on a phone that they're actually a victim of rape. In fact, they're less likely to admit it to themselves, let alone someone else. Anyway, let's continue.
But really, when men are concerned about rape, their biggest concern is being falsely accused.
So our biggest fear is being falsely accused. So what he's doing here, he's trying to make the argument that MRAs are more concerned about false allegations than men actually being raped, and that we really don't give a shit about men being raped. Of course, ignoring the fact that we can care about both at exactly the same time. Activists can work on more than one issue at a time, right? So effectively what he's doing here is whataboutism.
Oh, you want to fill that pothole? Well, what about fixing the sidewalks on my street? Oh, so you care about
terrible tragedy.
Well, I didn't see you complaining during
other unrelated terrible tragedy.
Sure, there's false allegations, but what about all the men that are being raped? Why don't you talk about them? Even though we do.
Many in the manosphere believe that 40 or 50% of all rape allegations are false and that women are lying.
Many in the manosphere. Not the men's rights movement specifically, which is what the video is about, but the manosphere in general, right? So he's making as broad a claim as possible. And how many exactly is many? Is it 10%, 50%, 99%? What exactly is many? And he also makes the claim that we're accusing women of lying because it's all women who are liars, right? It has nothing to do with due process rights, which is what we're actually concerned about, okay? We're actually concerned about not just taking the word of the alleged victim, but looking at the evidence and giving someone due process rights and the right to a fair trial and a fair hearing. But due process rights are words that he doesn't say a single time in his whole video, because, why actually address what we're trying to talk about? It's much easier just to falsely associate us with other aspects of the manosphere, right? That's a much easier argument to make.
And they get that number from one discredited study.
Yeah, actually, it's a lot more complex than that. I know. Shocking, right? He's making the claim that there's one discredited study and that all the other studies show that it's really low. And that's simply not the case. There are numerous studies ranging from as low as 1.5% all the way up to 90%. Now, for the record, I don't think the 1.5% figure is accurate any more than I think the 90% figure is accurate. And I'll go into more detail about what the actual figures are in a little while.
When a woman reports a rape, sometimes there isn't enough information or evidence to prosecute, sometimes she changes her mind about pressing charges, and sometimes the guy is found not guilty. All of those added up is where they get that number.
Well, if that was the case, then the study would have false allegations in the 90s, because the majority of the time, women either drop the case or there's not enough evidence, or it goes to trial and the man is found not guilty. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that the rape didn't happen. It may mean that there just isn't enough evidence to prosecute. And the reason for that is because rape is a very tricky crime to prosecute, because in the vast majority of cases, it's a crime that takes place between two people in private with no witnesses and no evidence. Now, there may be evidence that sex took place. For example, sometimes women get rape kits. That's when they don't wait for weeks or months or even years before reporting it. But a rape kit is just evidence that sex took place. You then have to determine that sex was non-consensual. And that can be a very tricky thing to prove. But the same can be said for false allegations. Once again, we're talking about something that usually takes place in private with no witnesses. And it's basically one person's word against another. Now, there are some false allegations which can be proven. For example, person A says person B raped them, and then person A shows that they were in a different area at that time. Maybe they were at work, maybe they were in a different town or something like that, so they physically could not have done it. But if you're talking about two people who were alone together, and one says that it was consensual and the other one says it wasn't, it's very hard to prove one way or the other. And it's even more tricky when someone says this happened 20 or 30 years ago and there's no evidence apart from someone's word. But let's have a look at percentages and let's examine why feminists always get this wrong. Now, I'm going to use some statistics here which some people may have a problem with. Look, it doesn't matter if the stats you want to go with are slightly larger or whatever. My argument is still basically the same, okay? So for the sake of argument, just go with the stats I'm giving you. You'll see what I mean when I get stuck into it. Now, looking at RAIN's website, we can figure out that the conviction rate for rapists is around 2%. And according to numerous feminists, the false allegation rate is between 2 and 10%. Let's go with 2%. Alright, let's be really generous and say that 2% of allegations are false. Now, like I said, some people might say that the conviction rate is higher or that the false allegation rate is higher. Maybe it's 5%, maybe it's 10%. Doesn't matter, right? My point will still be the same. So if there's a 2% conviction rate and a 2% false allegation rate, that only accounts for 4% of all reported rapes. That means there's a whopping 96% unknown factor. We simply do not know if that 96% are true allegations or false allegations. We don't know if a rape took place or it didn't take place. And as I said, rape is a very hard thing to prove one way or the other because it's usually something that happens between two people in private with no evidence. It's one person's word against another. Very difficult to prove one way or the other. Now, if someone were to say there's only a 2% conviction rate, therefore 98% must be false, that would be a very, very bad argument because obviously not every single true allegation is going to be provable. Once again, it's a hard thing to prove. So it stands to reason that a lot of cases just don't have the evidence. But the exact same argument can be used for false allegations. Just because there's a 2% figure of proven false allegations, that doesn't mean that 98% are true. And this is the logical fallacy that feminists constantly fall into. You will constantly hear them quote the false allegation figures, be they 2% or 10% or 8% or 6.8% or whatever. It's always fairly low though. And they will assume that the remainder has to be true. Alright, if 2% are false, then 98% are true, and the fact that only 2% are prosecuted, well, that's because of patriarchy and rape culture and the fact that women's voices are oppressed, and we should lower the standard of evidence in courts of law so we can prosecute more of these guilty men who are getting away with it. Alright, in their opinion, 96% of rapists are just getting away with it, and that's only the reported ones. And that's simply not true. The very notion that the police somehow detect 100% of all false allegations is ludicrous. I mean, first of all, do you think they're spending as many resources on investigating false allegations as they are investigating actual rapes? I don't think they are. I think the only time they detect false allegations is where it's fucking really apparent. You know, like I said earlier, someone accuses someone of rape and it turns out that the person was at work or, they're in another city or something like that, right? And I don't think they investigate it unless there is a clear evidence that it's false. But we constantly hear feminists say that the Remainer has to be true, and we have to treat them as true. We have to believe every victim, even though the person technically isn't a victim because they haven't been proven to be a victim. We should say alleged victim, right? If we want to be accurate. And because they see this massive number of actual rapes, in their opinion, not being prosecuted, they want to lower the standards as much as possible. A woman's claim should be enough. No further evidence needed. There are actually feminists who believe that, and that is doing away with due process rights. I mean, people don't demand this for any other crime. And that's why we speak out against false allegations. Because due process rights are important. And I've only touched on reported rapes. That is, reported rapes to the police that go through the system. I haven't even touched on universities yet and how young men are being kicked out of universities without due process rights, without a fair hearing, without, in some cases, being able to present any evidence, or how some people have lost their jobs based on nothing but an allegation on Twitter. These are potentially false allegations as well. Maybe a better term would be unproven allegations, because I'm sure some of them are actually accurate. But the point remains the same. People are missing out on due process rights. That's the issue.
If you go to the police to report that your bike was stolen and they don't find enough evidence to pursue it, that doesn't change the fact that your bike was stolen.
Now, he uses this stupid bike analogy again later on, as if being accused of stealing someone's bike is the same as being accused of raping someone. Because, you know, there's been a lot of men kicked out of universities over false bike stealing allegations, right? And let's not forget the section of the Me Too movement on Twitter, which deals with people having their bikes stolen. There's a lot of people who have lost their jobs over allegations of stealing bikes, right? Because we take stealing bikes so seriously that it's right up there with rape. Virtually no difference. Fucking incredible. I mean, do you even go to jail for stealing a bike? I don't know. I've never stolen a bike before, so I don't know what the penalty is. But I imagine it's not as severe as raping someone and going to prison. And I guess I should ask the question, do you think we should just take the word of a person who claims to have their bike stolen, or do you think the police should investigate and see if there's any evidence? Because there are definitely feminists out there who believe we should just take the word of the alleged victim and, you know, not even worry about a trial or anything like that, or lower the standard in the legal system as much as possible. Do you think they do that with allegations of stealing bikes, knowing better? I somehow don't think so. I think these two things are completely different, are of two completely different magnitudes. And I think you know that. I mean, if you don't know that, you're a complete fucking idiot. And I don't think you're a complete idiot, I just think you're a dishonest asshole. But I should talk a little bit about how feminists are chipping away at due process in the legal system, not just on college campuses, but in actual courts of law as well. Just last year in Canada, Bill C-51 was passed. Now, if you're unfamiliar with Bill C-51 in Canada, it basically limits the type of evidence that can be put into court cases. So any text messages of a sexual nature can just be dismissed without even being looked at by the court. Now, they claim the reason why they do this is because they don't want to slut-shame the alleged victim to bias the court and, you know, let the guilty party off scot-free. But what it does as a consequence is often exclude legitimate evidence to show that the alleged victim is actually lying. For example, here's part of a blog by a lawyer, a defense lawyer, and she says, "What happens when the complaint starts texting our client about the alleged sexual assault, but describes it as if it were a consensual sexual encounter, or tells the police and later the court that she stopped talking to her client last year, but has actually sent him nudes and explicit messages once a week since making the police report?" Now, I personally would think that would be relevant in a rape case. Okay, if someone's claiming he raped me a year ago, I haven't spoken to him since then, but we find out later on that she's been texting him and sending him nudes, I think that would be relevant. But apparently it's not in Canada. Apparently that shouldn't be admitted into a court of law because, they're trying to get the maximum amount of convictions even when the guy's innocent. Like I said, this isn't about hating women or about trying to restrict actual rape victims from coming forward or any of those other bullshit arguments that feminists put forward and claim that we're actually on about. This is basic due process rights. And rape should not have a special standard of due process that other criminal cases don't have. Okay? It's that simple. Once again, due process rights are words that Knowing Better will not mention anywhere in his video. Not a single time. Strange that, right? Considering it's really at the heart of what we talk about.
That is not a false allegation. Numerous studies have been done on this, and all of them have found that false rape allegations occur between 2 and 10% of the time.
No, actually, the numerous studies show it's between 1.5% and 90%. But, you're only going to focus on the smaller ones, aren't you? Strange that. And the interesting thing is, his citation doesn't even support what he just said. He said between 2% and 10%. But if you actually look at it, it says 10.9%. So it's actually closer to 11% if I want to nitpick. So you may be asking, why do these studies range between 1.5% and 90%? That's a huge inconsistency between studies, right? Well, there's numerous reasons. It obviously depends on when the study was done, where it was done, the number of people that it involved, and it also comes down to how you define what a false allegation really is. In fact, that's the key aspect to it. And although Knowing Better has a good point that some of the studies have used a very broad net in defining what a false allegation is, and that's obviously wrong because not everyone who drops a case is lying, obviously, and just because the accused is found not guilty, that doesn't mean the offence didn't take place. It just means there may not have been enough evidence. But at the same time, the studies that come out with 2% and 5% or whatever are also biased because they really narrow the scope of what is a false allegation as much as possible. And that's exactly what the report he shows has done. They've cherry-picked the smallest numbers in an attempt to minimize the number of false allegations as much as possible. And we even see this with the Crown Prosecution Services in England that has become very feminist-centric in a desire to get as many rape convictions as possible and to minimize the number of false allegations as much as possible. And when I say minimize, I mean the recording of those false allegations, even to the point where they won't prosecute someone who's made a false allegation who has mental illness. Now, one of the main reasons for someone to make a false allegation is mental illness. Now, you may say, well, if someone's mentally ill, then, maybe they shouldn't be prosecuted like a normal, competent person. There's an argument there, but the fact is it's not recorded as a false allegation, even though it is an allegation which is false. And then the Crown Prosecution releases the number of false allegations which have actually been prosecuted, and surprisingly, it's a very small number. And then they make the argument, well, there's almost no false allegations, it's like they don't exist. So yeah, the people who make the claims that allegations almost don't exist are almost always coming from a very biased perspective, and they are attempting to minimize the number as much as possible.
With the largest study finding 6.8%, meaning that a woman is only making it up 6.8% of the time.
No, it doesn't mean that at all. It means there was only sufficient evidence 6.8% of the time. You're forgetting about all those cases where the woman was making it up, but there just wasn't enough evidence to class it as a false allegation. Remember what you said just minutes earlier?
If you go to the police to report that your bike was stolen and they don't find enough evidence to pursue it, that doesn't change the fact that your bike was stolen.
Funny he forgot that. He's got a completely different standard when it comes to false allegations. Only the ones which are 100% provable actually are false allegations. Somehow the police are able to determine 100% of false allegations amazingly. But let's have a look at that study that he cites. So this largest study that was ever done, the most comprehensive, I think he said, is the MAD study, or Making a Difference study. And it was undertaken by non-profit organisation End Violence Against Women International. Well, I'm sure they were completely unbiased in their data gathering. I'm sure there was absolutely no bias there whatsoever. Right? Yeah.
Believe it or not, but that's actually pretty consistent with the false allegation rate for just about every crime, including bicycle theft.
Yeah, but falsely accusing someone of stealing your bike doesn't have the same consequences as accusing someone of rape, does it? You're comparing apples and oranges here. I mean, look, let me give you the best case scenario knowing better. Let's say the rate of false rape allegations was half that of false allegations concerning people stealing bikes. False allegations of rape would still be a bigger issue because the consequences are so much more severe. If there are, for example, if there's 10 times as many paper cuts as there are car accidents, that doesn't mean we should be more concerned about paper cuts. We should be more concerned, obviously, about car accidents because the consequences are more severe, right? No one is losing their jobs because of accusations on Twitter about stealing bikes. No one is being kicked out of universities due to allegations of stealing bikes. There are not activists constantly whittling down due process rights in courts of law concerning stealing bikes. These two things are not equivalent. And to say, well, the false allegation rate is just the same as other crimes, therefore it's not really that relevant, is fucking bullshit. Once again, it would have been nice if you mentioned due process rights at least once in your video. But you're not really interested in dealing with the actual issues, are you? You just like playing games with statistics.
In fact, parsing out the numbers, as a man, you are more likely to be the victim of a rape than you are to be falsely accused of a rape. Oh, you want to fill that pothole? Well, what about fixing the sidewalks on my street? Oh, so you care about
terrible tragedy.
Well, I didn't see you complaining during
other unrelated terrible tragedy.
Now, the reason I think he's using whataboutism here is because of one of his citations. It's called Men Are More Likely to Be Raped Than Be Falsely Accused of Rape. And the article is essentially saying, well, because men are far more likely to be raped than falsely accused, we should just focus on the men being raped part, which of course they won't do anyway. And as I pointed out earlier, there's no reason why we can't talk about both. It's not a one or the other type thing. But I do have numerous issues with this article. First of all, the definition of rape excludes females raping males, that is, made to penetrate, because that dramatically changes the numbers as I showed earlier. And they do make the point that vastly more women are raped. So their argument goes, we should be more concerned about men being raped than false allegations, but at the same time we should be more concerned about women being raped. So really we shouldn't be concerned about men at all, as opposed to, being concerned about all those things. But yeah, once again, obviously they don't include force to penetrate because, that would show very different figures, wouldn't it? And then they compare the number of men who have been raped to the number of women who have been prosecuted for false rape allegations. Now, it's interesting that they only include prosecutions because, as I pointed out earlier, the CPS really narrows the scope on who they will prosecute. For example, someone with mental illness who has made a false allegation, most of the time will not be prosecuted, even though the allegation they make is in fact false. And they really try very, very hard not to prosecute anyone for false allegations. So those 35 people were cases where they really couldn't avoid it. And it doesn't include all the cases which they just let off the hook, or all the cases where there just wasn't enough evidence. Now, the interesting thing is, as I said, they're comparing prosecutions of false rape allegations to men who have been raped, but not men who have had successful rape prosecution cases against their rapist. So obviously these two pieces of data have very different standards. One is from a survey where the male rape victim may not have even reported the rape, let alone gone through the court system. So there's really no standard of evidence. Not that I'm suggesting that they're lying or anything, but I'm just saying there's a different standard of evidence compared to prosecuting someone for an allegation which really requires a very, very high standard of evidence in this particular case. So yeah, this is basically whataboutism. It's let's ignore false rape allegations, because what about the male rape victims? We really need to focus on them more. Oh, but by the way, there's more women being raped, so we really need to focus on them more. So let's just forget about the men.
It does happen, and it's awful, but it's very, very rare.
Very, very rare. Well, that's interesting, considering his own citation, which he even mentioned in his video, says 10.9%. Not that he said 10.9%, he just said 10%. He rounded it down instead of rounding it up to 11%. But anyway, 10.9%, that's basically 1 in 9 cases. That's not very, very rare. If every time someone went to KFC, they had a 1 in 9 chance of getting botulism, do you think KFC would still be in business? If every time someone got on a plane, they had a 1 in 9 chance of ending up in a crash, do you think people would feel safe flying? What if 1 in every 9 women who wanted to get an abortion was prevented from doing so? Would you be okay with that? Because, you know, it would be very, very rare. And as we know, if something is very, very rare, then it's really not that much of a concern, is it? 1 in 9 is most definitely not very, very rare. Even 2%, I would say, is not very, very rare. That's 1 in 50. And need I point out yet again, that's just the cases which go through the court system. It's not including all the allegations on social media. It's not including the kangaroo courts in the university system where someone can be kicked out without due process rights based on just an allegation. And he really doesn't take into account the impact that these allegations can have on people. Okay, I was just about to start recording the final part of this video when I came across something which I really need to talk about. It's because it's very, very relevant to something I've been talking about all through this video. And apparently this has just been released too. It's from the American Bar Association. Commission on Domestic and Sexual Violence Criminal Justice Section, Civil Rights and Social Justice Section, report to the House of Delegates. So they've got a resolution which basically puts the burden of proof on the accused that there was consent. Now, as you may imagine, that's not an easy thing to do because, as I've said numerous times in this video already, sex usually takes place between two people in private with no witnesses, no video evidence, and no evidence at all. So how you're meant to prove that you got consent via words or actions is unknown to me. It's strange. So let's have a quick look at their reasoning. Now, I should point out I'm not a lawyer, but I have read through this and I think I understand it, and I'm happy for anyone to read through it and correct me if they think I'm wrong. Link in the description as always. Or you can pause the video and read the sections that I'm quickly summarizing. So their reasoning for changing this, or wanting to change this, is that a victim may not flee or resist during a rape because of panic. They may become what's called frozen fright, where they are unable or incapable of resisting or getting away. And look, I think in some circumstances that would very well be the case. It says here, this body of work can be simplified as identifying 3 common states of inaction that can affect victims: disassociation, tonic immobility, and collapsed immobility. So like I said, they're incapable of resisting or getting away. They basically shut down because they're in a state of severe panic. It's like a deer in the headlights situation. So it goes on to say that just because someone is passive, that does not mean that they're willing. In other words, an absence of a no does not necessarily mean yes, to put it in really simplistic terms. Once again, feel free to read the report or to pause the screen and read it in more detail if you wish. And once again, in principle, I would agree. Just because someone doesn't say no doesn't necessarily mean they're saying yes. It then goes on to say in the conclusion, a history of sexual violence and the status of women as sexual property of men. Yeah, that doesn't sound like it's ideologically biased. Still informs the law governing sexual assault, and that should stop. The proposed definition is a step in that direction. The ABA should recognise the inherent right of sexual autonomy and lead the way towards implementation in legal codes in every jurisdiction of requiring words or actions to express consent to sexual activity. So basically, whenever 2 people have sex, there has to be implied consent either through action or words. Now, I'm assuming that consent only has to come from the female and not the male, because that's the way these things tend to go. Now, my question is, how would you prove it? How would you prove in a court of law that you got consent? And I guess that's an issue we have at present, but this is putting the burden on the accused to prove that there was actual consent. In the words of the National Association of Criminal Defence Lawyers, NACDL opposes ABA Resolution 114 because it shifts the burden of proof by requiring an accused person to prove affirmative consent to each sexual act rather than requiring the prosecution to provide lack of consent, the group wrote. The resolution assumes guilt in the absence of any evidence regarding consent. This radical change in the law would violate the Due Process Clause of the 5th and 14th Amendments and the presumption of innocence. So I don't understand how someone accused is meant to prove that they got consent. Are they meant to have witnesses? Are you meant to have a notary there to watch and to make a record of exactly what happened and who gave consent at what time? Should all sexual encounters be videoed from now on? I'm sure that in itself would lead to a huge number of problems. Not that I'm proposing that in a serious sense, but you might want to consider it. And what about cases where there was an accusation of rape, but sex didn't even take place? I mean, up until now, I've been talking about cases where sex actually did take place, and the dispute is over whether consent actually took place or not. But what about cases where someone points the finger at someone and says, he raped me, and they never actually had sex? And there have been those cases. How are you meant to prove affirmative consent when the sexual act never even took place in the first place? It's an impossibility. Of course, one way I guess you could prove that there was consent in those cases where there actually was sex is things like text messages. You know, if you get a text message afterwards saying, had a great time last night, look forward to doing it again, that would probably indicate that, you know, there was consent and it wasn't a rape. But as we saw with Canada, they're trying to block those types of that type of evidence being presented in courts. I'm not sure how that is in America, but it wouldn't surprise me if at least in some places they have a very similar thing. And if not yet, then it's only a matter of time, isn't it? Just a quick update. I was just about finished with this video, and I found there's an update. Apparently there is a judge in Canada who has ruled Bill C-51 as unconstitutional, which I think is really good news. It's still early days. We're yet to see what's going to happen, but hopefully Bill C-51 will eventually be scrapped. Although I'm not holding my breath. We'll have to wait and see. Anyway, on to the planned ending I had for this video. And as Knowing Better is talking about rape and sexual assault, as well as responding to the red pill, I think it's only fair that I bring up that one of the people interviewed in the red pill movie has since been accused of sexual assault. Now, if there are any feminists or social justice warriors watching at this point, they're probably rubbing their hands with glee, thinking, I knew that evil Paul Elam would be the one, but it's not Paul Elam. Paul Elam has not raped or sexually assaulted anyone. And it's not Dr. Warren Farrell or Aaron Pitsey or Karen Strawn or Harry Crotch or Fred Hayward or any of the other MRAs who were interviewed in the red pill. So you may be wondering, if it's not an MRA who was interviewed in the red pill, then who is it who's been accused of sexual assault? And it would be no other than Dr. Michael Kimmel, the beloved male feminist, Dr. Michael Kimmel. When I say beloved, I mean beloved by his fellow feminists. MRAs hate him with good reason. So he's a professor of gender studies at Stony Brook University, and he tends to lecture on how evil masculinity is. Ironic, right? And he's also the author of a book, Angry White Men. Maybe he should write another one called Rapey Feminist Men. I don't know. Now, look, to be fair, I don't know if he's guilty or not, and he should be given the benefit of the doubt until he's been proven guilty in a court of law, which I doubt will ever happen because it was an anonymous allegation. And how exactly are you meant to defend yourself against an anonymous allegation? Now, I can understand why an actual victim may not want to come forward. It would, obviously you have the public spotlight on you concerning a very traumatic and private thing. It makes perfect sense why someone would want to remain anonymous. However, it makes defending yourself against that allegation virtually impossible. How are you meant to say, I never slept with a particular person at a particular time, if you don't know who that person is or when that particular time was? Now, I guess you could say, I've never slept with a student, but it's hard to prove if you don't know when the allegation supposedly took place, when it was. You can't say, well, I was teaching a class at that time, or I was in another state, or I have witnesses to show where I am, because you don't know when that particular time of the supposed incident took place. Like I said, virtually impossible to defend yourself against. So I don't know if he's guilty or not, but it's bad for him either way. Either he is a male feminist who has been shitting on men and men's rights activists his entire career and getting praise by his fellow feminists saying what an enlightened male he is for showing all of us what masculinity should really be about, and it turns out he's actually just a sexual predator. Or alternatively, he's totally innocent and he's been accused by someone, I don't know why, maybe to get revenge. I know that there are some people who don't like him. One person wrote a very, very angry article about Dr. Michael Kimmel, which I'll link below because I recommend you go read it. It's quite amusing. It seems Dr. Michael Kimmel doesn't live up to her purity test. So clearly he has pissed off some feminists for not being extreme enough. Now, those of you who know Michael Kimmel may find that funny, that he is being targeted by extremists for not being extreme enough, but that's simply the case. So maybe one of them made the false allegation. I don't know. But that would be ironic, considering it's people like Michael Kimmel who dismiss false allegations as not being important or rarely happening, and, really we shouldn't focus on them at all. Now, the allegation happened a year ago, and to my knowledge, Dr. Michael Kimmel is still teaching. If someone knows differently, please correct me below, but I haven't been able to find any recent articles on the incident. But if it was a student at that same university who had been accused by an anonymous source, I'm pretty sure that student would have been expelled from the university at this point, most likely without due process rights, without a lawyer, without being able to ask questions of the accuser, and most probably without presenting evidence. So I guess it's a different standard for enlightened feminist men like Dr. Michael Kimmel, because if it was the same standard that was applied to male students, he'd already be gone.
And now for a very interesting story. In 2003, a promising young football player went to prison for a crime that never happened. On Thursday, 26-year-old Brian Banks saw his conviction tossed out after his accuser changed her story. Lee Cowan spoke with Banks after his emotional day in court and just before he was officially set free.
That's the only thing left, though, of this nightmare, I guess.
That, and just start working on the mental and emotional, the repair there.
That ankle tracking bracelet has been locked on Brian Banks' left leg for years.
It's day to day.
Good day to day, then.
Yeah, best day.
He found out just as we were sitting down for our interview that loathsome bracelet was finally coming off.
This is by far the heaviest weight that I've ever had to carry around.
Today he's been labeled innocent.
10 years ago, Brian Banks was wrongly convicted of raping a classmate while in high school. And on Thursday, the now 26-year-old sobbed as the judge finally threw out the bogus charges that had sent him to prison for more than 5 years.
What went through your mind?
Everything just grabbed me at once, and it just consumed me at that moment. And so it was bittersweet. And I was so happy to hear those words, but just I'm still left with that question of why.
Long Beach Police says they have it!
At 16, Brian Banks was the star linebacker for his Long Beach high school. He had a full-ride scholarship to USC and had dreamed to play in the NFL.
That scholarship to USC was just waiting for you.
It was there. All I had to do was just play my senior year, the biggest year of my life.
Instead, a brief, albeit passionate, encounter with a female classmate in this high school stairwell changed everything.
We began making out, we kissed, groped, touched. We didn't have sex. Sex never occurred.
But the girl claimed rape, and before Brian knew it, he was under arrest.
I was awakened with a number of officers in my room. One officer had his knee to my back as I was laying down, and there were guns drawn. They threw me in a squad car, and I never came home.
There was no proof that you were guilty, no physical evidence, no DNA evidence, nothing.
Nothing whatsoever.
It was your word against hers.
Mm-hmm.
And hers won?
Hers won because mine was never heard.
Despite his claims of innocence, he says his defense attorney gave him a choice. Plead no contest to rape or risk a trial that could send him to prison for life.
If I go into that courtroom, the jury was going to automatically see a big black teenager and would automatically assume me as guilty.
That's what she told you?
That's what she told me. And so I asked her, well, can I at least speak to my mother? And she said, no, this is your decision to make, and you need to make it now. And so I took the plea.
He ended up finishing high school while in prison, and he had to register as a sex offender. He thought that was the end of it. But after he was released, came a surprise, a friend request on Facebook from the girl, now a woman, who had ruined his young life.
So what went through your mind, though, when you got that Facebook message?
I didn't even think it was her. I thought it was somebody playing a joke on me.
He agreed to meet her with a private investigator who videotaped the whole thing. And finally, the confession came.
Did he rape you? No, he did not rape me.
But that's as far as it went.
Did she apologize?
No.
Not even an I'm sorry?
No.
Nothing.
No.
And she never explained why she did it. But it was enough evidence for attorneys from the Innocence Project to get Brian's conviction overturned.
Are you angry?
No, I'm not angry.
How could you not be?
I've been there. I've been at that point of anger and bitterness when I first received that 6-year sentence. But then I realized that that type of energy only holds me back. It does nothing to the people that I'm angry about. You have to forgive and move on.
He's working to get his life back on track and has never lost his dream of being in the NFL.
Where do you want to play?
Whoever will give me an opportunity.
He's already chosen how to live. Now, he's free to live. For CBS This Morning, I'm Lee Cowan in Los Angeles.
What an incredible story. Mm-hmm. Two things. One, when you look at this story, you sometimes wish that for lawyers you could get a second opinion.
You mean when he talks about what he was faced with the defense attorney? It's true, because it's interesting as he lays out there that he says, well, can I talk to my mom? Yeah. And you would think anybody would say, look, this is a kid in high school. Of course you can talk to your parents. And she advises, no, you have to make the decision now. As he tells the story,
And what is the woman thinking about when she tries to befriend him?
That there is no answer for. No. Absolutely
Amazing
not.
Story.
He's quite an inspirational
And
man.
what happens to him now?
Hopefully, great things. Yeah. Well deserved, that's for sure.